Entry title: Judge sentences quiet black teen girl to life. Has no idea one phone call will bring down the system. The courthouse in Millstone was old, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of generations. On this gray morning, the air was thick with tension. In the defendant's chair sat 17-year-old Zariah Lane, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She was quiet, almost invisible, but her silence was not weakness. It was the armor she'd learned to wear in a world that rarely listened. Judge Harold Whitaker, a man with a reputation for being tough on crime, peered down at Zariah over his glasses. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, police, and townspeople filled every seat, hungry for a verdict. Zariah's public defender, Ms. Patel, stood beside her, exhausted from weeks of fighting a case that seemed lost from the start. Zariah had been accused of a crime she didn't commit, a robbery gone wrong, pinned on her by a system that saw her skin before her soul. The evidence was thin, but the prosecution was relentless. They painted her as a threat, a shadow in the night. Zariah's alibi, her school records, her teacher's pleas, all were drowned out by the weight of bias and fear. As the judge read the sentence, life in prison without parole, a gasp rippled through the room. Zariah's mother, Gloria, wept silently in the back row. Zariah didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes, her mind racing with memories of her little brother's laughter, her grandmother's stories, the dreams she'd scribbled in her journal. She wondered if she'd ever see the sky again. After the verdict, Zariah was led away in handcuffs. The world outside the courthouse moved on, but inside, something had shifted. Miss Patel, devastated by the injustice, made one last phone call before leaving the building. She dialed the number of an old friend, investigative journalist Theo Brooks, and left a message. "You need to look into this case. Something's not right." Theo was known for his relentless pursuit of the truth. He'd grown up in Millstone, left for the city, and returned with a mission to expose the cracks in the system. When he heard Ms. Patel's message, he dropped everything. He started digging into police records, witness statements, and the judge's history. What he found was a pattern. Young black defendants, harsh sentences, and a web of connections between the judge, the prosecutor, and the private prison industry. Meanwhile, Zariah struggled to survive in prison. She kept to herself, reading books from the library and writing letters to her family. She watched as other girls lost hope, swallowed by the system. But Zariah refused to let the darkness win. She began tutoring other inmates, helping them study for their GEDs, listening to their stories. She became a quiet force for good, her kindness a small rebellion against despair. Theo's investigation gained momentum. He uncovered evidence that key witnesses had been pressured, that exculpatory evidence had been withheld, and that Judge Whitaker had financial ties to the company running the local prison. He published a series of articles, each one more damning than the last. The town was rocked by scandal. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, demanding justice for Zariah and all those like her. Gloria, Zariah's mother, found her own courage. She spoke at rallies, telling her daughter's story with a voice that trembled but never broke. She met with lawmakers, civil rights groups, and anyone who would listen. "My daughter is not a statistic," she said. "She is a child, a dreamer, a light in this world. She deserves justice." The pressure mounted. The governor ordered a review of Zariah's case. New lawyers took up her defense, armed with the evidence Theo had uncovered. The judge was placed under investigation, and the prosecutor resigned in disgrace. Zariah's conviction was overturned, and she walked out of prison into the arms of her family, her spirit battered but unbroken. But the story didn't end there. Zariah became an advocate for others trapped by the system. She spoke at schools, in churches, and on national television, her quiet strength inspiring a movement. Judge Whitaker was tried and convicted for corruption, his legacy forever tarnished. The private prison contracts were canceled, and reforms swept through Millstone and beyond. Zariah's journey was not just about her own redemption, but about the power of one voice, one phone call, to bring down a system built on injustice. She learned that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive, and that the fight for justice was never truly over. Zariah's first days of freedom felt surreal. The world outside prison gates was both familiar and strange. She walked through her old neighborhood, greeted by neighbors who had followed her story and now saw her as a symbol of hope. Some apologized for doubting her, others simply hugged her, tears in their eyes. Zariah accepted it all with quiet grace, her heart full but cautious. At home, Gloria cooked Zariah's favorite meal, okra stew and cornbread. The family gathered, laughter and relief filling the small apartment. Zariah's little brother, Malik, clung to her side, afraid she might disappear again. That night, Zariah sat by her window, looking up at the stars. She promised herself she would use her freedom to help others still trapped by injustice. Theo Brooks continued his investigation, uncovering more stories like Zariah's. He found a pattern of corruption that stretched beyond Millstone, judges and prosecutors profiting from harsh sentences, families torn apart by greed and prejudice. His articles sparked a statewide review of convictions, and soon, other wrongfully imprisoned people began to find hope. Zariah was invited to speak at a town hall meeting. She stood before a packed room, her voice steady. "I was sentenced not because of what I did, but because of who I am. This system is broken, but we can fix it if we listen, if we care, if we refuse to look away." Her words resonated, and people began to organize, demanding accountability and reform. Ms. Patel, her former public defender, became a close friend and mentor. She encouraged Zariah to consider law school, seeing in her the makings of a powerful advocate. Zariah hesitated. Her memories of courtrooms were still raw, but the idea took root. She began volunteering with a local legal aid group, helping families navigate the justice system. Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker's trial became a national spectacle. Testimony revealed years of corruption, with dozens of cases tainted by bias and greed. Whitaker sat stone-faced as former colleagues and victims described the pain he had caused. In the end, he was convicted and sentenced to prison, a stark reversal of roles that sent a message across the country. Zariah's story inspired others to come forward. A group of formerly incarcerated youth formed a support network, sharing resources and advocating for change. Zariah became their unofficial leader, her calm presence and lived experience giving them strength. Together, they lobbied for new laws, ending private prison contracts, mandating body cameras, and funding education over incarceration. Gloria watched her daughter with pride and awe. She remembered the quiet girl who once hid behind books, now standing tall before crowds. "You're changing the world," she whispered one night. Zariah smiled, her eyes shining. "I'm just making sure no one else has to go through what I did." As months passed, Millstone transformed. The courthouse that once echoed with injustice now hosted community forums and restorative justice circles. Police and judges attended training on bias and trauma. Schools invited Zariah to speak, her story a lesson in resilience and the power of truth. But Zariah never forgot the girls she'd left behind in prison. She visited often, bringing books, hope, and news of the world outside. She listened to their stories, promising to fight for their freedom. Each visit reminded her that the struggle was far from over, but also that every act of kindness, every voice raised, could tip the scales toward justice. Zariah's advocacy began to reach beyond Millstone. She was invited to speak at universities, legal conferences, and rallies in cities she'd only read about. Each time, she told her story with honesty and humility, never letting the spotlight distract her from the work. She met other survivors of injustice, men and women who had lost years to a system that saw them as disposable. At one conference, Zariah met Dr. Simone Carter, a renowned civil rights attorney. Dr. Carter listened to Zariah's story and saw in her a rare combination of pain and purpose. "You have a gift," she told Zariah. "You turn suffering into strength. The world needs more voices like yours." Dr. Carter offered Zariah a scholarship to a summer program for aspiring lawyers. Zariah accepted, her heart pounding with hope and fear. The program was challenging. Zariah found herself surrounded by students from privileged backgrounds, many of whom had never known struggle. At first, she felt out of place, but as the weeks passed, she realized her experience gave her a perspective others lacked. She excelled in debates, her arguments rooted in lived reality. Professors took notice, encouraging her to apply to law school. Back in Millstone, Theo Brooks continued his reporting. He exposed more corruption, leading to the resignation of several officials. The town's new leadership, inspired by Zariah's courage, prioritized transparency and community engagement. Gloria was asked to serve on a new oversight committee, her voice helping to shape a more just future. Zariah's visits to the prison became a lifeline for many girls still inside. She brought news of reforms, letters from supporters, and stories of hope. She encouraged them to write their own stories, to believe in the possibility of freedom. Some girls began to study for their GEDs, others started art projects or support groups. Zariah's presence was a reminder that they were not forgotten. One day, Zariah received a letter from a girl named Tasha, who had been sentenced as a teenager for a crime she didn't commit. Tasha wrote of her despair, her anger, and her longing for justice. Zariah visited her, listening to her story and promising to help. With Dr. Carter's guidance, Zariah and a team of lawyers took on Tasha's case, uncovering evidence of misconduct and winning her release. The victory was bittersweet. Tasha, like Zariah, had lost years to the system, but her freedom was a testament to the power of persistence and solidarity. Zariah and Tasha became close friends, their bond forged in struggle and hope. Together, they spoke at events, their voices amplifying the call for reform. As Zariah's reputation grew, so did the movement she inspired. Formerly incarcerated youth, families, and allies organized marches, petitioned lawmakers, and demanded change. Zariah remained at the center, her quiet strength guiding others through setbacks and victories alike. Zariah's journey to law school was not easy. She juggled advocacy work, family responsibilities, and her own healing. There were nights when the weight of trauma threatened to pull her under, but she found solace in her community. Gloria and Malik cheered her on, and Tasha became both confidant and co-conspirator in their shared mission for justice. Law school opened new doors. Zariah excelled in her classes, her lived experience giving her a unique edge. She interned at a nonprofit that fought wrongful convictions, working late into the night on cases that reminded her of her own. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like a step toward redemption, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been failed by the system. Meanwhile, Millstone continued to transform. The Oversight Committee, with Gloria's steady leadership, implemented new policies for police accountability and fair sentencing. Community forums became a regular event where residents and officials discussed issues openly. The courthouse, once a symbol of fear, now stood for hope and possibility. Zariah's friendship with Tasha deepened. They traveled together, speaking at schools and community centers. Tasha's art, inspired by her years behind bars, became a powerful tool for healing and advocacy. Their partnership showed others that even the deepest wounds could become sources of strength. One day, Zariah received a call from Ms. Patel, her former public defender. Ms. Patel had nominated her for a national award recognizing young leaders in justice reform. Zariah was stunned. She traveled to Washington, D.C., where she stood on stage before a crowd of activists, lawmakers, and survivors. She spoke of pain, resilience, and the power of a single phone call to change everything. Her speech was broadcast across the country. Letters poured in from people who had been inspired by her story, some seeking help, others offering support. Zariah responded to as many as she could, always reminding people that they were not alone. She encouraged them to organize, to speak out, and to believe in the possibility of change. As graduation approached, Zariah reflected on her journey. She had gone from a quiet, invisible girl to a leader in a national movement. She had faced injustice and turned it into a force for good. She knew the fight was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, and she was determined to use it. On the day of her graduation, Zariah wore a bracelet made by Tasha, a symbol of their shared struggle and triumph. Gloria and Malik cheered from the audience, tears streaming down their faces. As Zariah accepted her diploma, she looked out at the crowd and smiled, knowing that her story was just one of many, and that together they could bring down any system built on injustice. After graduation, Zariah returned to Millstone, not as a victim, but as a force for change. She opened a legal clinic with Tasha, offering free representation to those who couldn't afford it. The clinic quickly became a beacon for the community, a place where hope was restored and justice was pursued with compassion. Zariah's work caught national attention. She was invited to join a task force on criminal justice reform, advising lawmakers on policies to prevent wrongful convictions and end the profit-driven prison system. Her insights, rooted in lived experience, shaped new laws that protected the vulnerable and held the powerful accountable. Gloria, now a respected community leader, watched her daughter with pride. Malik, inspired by his sister's courage, began volunteering at the clinic, dreaming of becoming a lawyer himself. Tasha's art adorned the walls, each piece telling a story of pain transformed into hope. One evening, Zariah received a call from a mother whose son had just been arrested. The fear in the woman's voice was all too familiar. Zariah listened, offered comfort, and promised to help. She knew that every case was a chance to make the system a little more just, a little more humane. Years passed, and Millstone became a model for other towns. The courthouse, once a place of despair, now stood as a symbol of redemption. Zariah's clinic expanded, training new generations of advocates. She traveled the country, sharing her story and teaching others how to fight for justice with empathy and resolve. At a national conference, Zariah stood on stage, her voice steady and strong. "One phone call can change everything," she said. "Never underestimate the power of your voice, your courage, your truth. Together, we can bring down any system built on injustice and build something better in its place." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Zariah looked out at the sea of faces, survivors, dreamers, fighters, and felt a deep sense of peace. She knew her journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. She had sparked a movement, and together they would keep pushing forward. As the sun set over Millstone, Zariah walked home through streets filled with laughter and hope. She paused beneath the courthouse steps, remembering the girl she once was. She smiled, knowing that her story, born of pain, shaped by courage, and redeemed by justice, would inspire others for generations to come.